Imagine being arrested hundreds of years ago. Maybe you committed a crime, maybe you were captured in war, or maybe you simply angered the wrong government. You're dragged through a gate and thrown into a cell. There's no bed, barely any light, the walls are damp, the floor is filthy, and somewhere nearby, another prisoner is screaming. Today, prison usually means losing your freedom. Throughout history, it could mean something much worse. Starvation, disease, isolation, overcrowding, and conditions so terrible that surviving your sentence became the real punishment. These were some of the most horrifying prisons in human history. Number 1. The dungeon beneath Rome. Let's begin in ancient Rome. Near the Roman Forum stood a prison known today as the Mamertine prison, but the worst part was underneath it, a dark underground chamber known as a Tullianum. Imagine being lured into a stone room right beneath the city. Little natural light, cold stone walls, and almost nowhere to go. Roman prisons generally weren't designed for long-term rehab. They were often places where prisoners waited for trial, for punishment, or for execution. Some of Rome's enemies ended their lives here. Jugurtha, the captured king of Numidia, was imprisoned in the Tullianum after being paraded through Rome. Ancient accounts say he eventually died here. Others were executed inside the prison itself. Above you, Rome continued normally. Markets opened, politicians argued, crowds filled the streets. Meanwhile, you sat on the ground, waiting to discover whether you would ever see daylight again. Number 2. The island you couldn't leave. Now imagine your prison doesn't need an enormous wall, because outside is the Mediterranean Sea. Off the coast of Marseille stands the Château d'If. Originally built as a fortress, it later became a prison, and its location made escape extremely difficult. But not every prisoner lived the same way. If you had money, you could pay for better accommodation. Some wealthy prisoners received private rooms with fireplaces and windows. But if you were poor, your experience could be completely different. The worst cells were underground, dark, damp, filthy, filled with vermin. According to the site's official history, prisoners in these dungeons rarely survived more than a few weeks. No dramatic escape tunnel, no secret treasure, and despite what the Count of Monte Cristo made famous, Edmond Dantes was fictional. The real prison didn't need an imaginary story to be horrifying. All it needed was a locked door, an underground cell, and an ocean between you and freedom. Number 3. London's Nightmare Prison. For centuries, one name terrified prisoners in London: Newgate. The prison operated in different forms for hundreds of years, and it developed an awful reputation. Overcrowding, filth, lies, vermin, disease. Prisoners accused of very different crimes could find themselves packed together. And historically, money could change your experience. Those who could pay might obtain better food or accommodation. Those who couldn't were left with whatever remained. Disease spread easily through the crowded prison. So-called jail fever was a constant threat, and for many prisoners, Newgate wasn't even their final destination. It was where they waited to be executed. From 1783, public executions were carried out outside the prison. Huge crowds could gather to watch. Imagine spending your final night inside Newgate, knowing that outside, people were already arriving to watch you die. The prison wasn't merely a place of confinement. For some, it was a waiting room for the gallows. Number 4. A prison built around silence. In 1829, a revolutionary prison opened in Philadelphia, Eastern State Penitentiary. Its creators believed they had found a more humane way to deal with crime. Instead of overcrowding prisoners together, they would separate them completely. A prisoner could spend most of his existence all alone, alone in his cell, alone while working, and originally alone during exercise. The idea wasn't simply punishment. Isolation would supposedly encourage prisoners to reflect, repent, and change. There was just one problem. Human beings aren't particularly good at extreme isolation. Silence became part of the punishment. Even guards could muffle their footsteps while walking the corridors. Prison records describe punishments for prisoners caught communicating. When Charles Dickens visited in 1842, he was horrified. He believed the psychological suffering caused by the system was cruel. Eventually, the original system began breaking down. The prison became increasingly overcrowded, and strict isolation was abandoned. A prison designed to improve the human mind had demonstrated just how badly isolation could affect it. Number 5. The Fiery Furnace. Now travel to colonial Vietnam. In Hanoi, French authorities constructed Hỏa Lò Prison. Name Hỏa Lò is associated with the furnaces and stove-making area that existed there before the prison, but the nickname became disturbingly appropriate. The prison was originally designed for only hundreds of inmates. Eventually, it held far more. Vietnamese prisoners, particularly political prisoners, were confined there during French colonial rule. Overcrowding became severe. Prisoners could be shackled to concrete platforms. Conditions were unsanitary and oppressive. The prison also contained a guillotine used by French authorities. Decades later, during the Vietnam War, the prison became famous again. Captured American pilots were held there, and sarcastically nicknamed it the Hanoi Hilton. Different prisoners under different governments experienced Hỏa Lò in different ways, but its history stretched across decades of colonialism, war, political imprisonment, and human suffering. Today, much of the original prison is gone. Part of it survives as a museum. Number 6. The prison colony across the ocean. Sometimes walls aren't necessary, especially when the geography does the job for you. For decades, France transported prisoners thousands of kilometers to French Guiana in South America. The penal colony became commonly associated with the name Devil's Island. The tropical environment could be brutal. Heat, heavy rain, mosquitoes, disease, and isolation. Some prisoners were forced to do hard labor. Others were confined for long periods. Even if someone escaped the prison itself, they weren't necessarily free. Dense jungles, dangerous rivers, disease, and enormous distances stood between them and civilization. Then came the psychological part. You weren't simply locked inside a building. You had been transported across an ocean to another continent. Home was thousands of kilometers away. Escape meant surviving the wilderness before authorities ever had to catch you. The prison wasn't just a cell. The prison actually was an entire landscape. Number 7. Andersonville. But perhaps one of the most horrifying prison environments in American history didn't begin as a mere stone fortress. It was an open field. During the American Civil War, captured Union soldiers were sent to Camp Sumter, better known as Andersonville. The camp was originally designed to hold around 10,000 prisoners. At its most crowded, more than 32,000 men were confined there. There weren't enough proper shelters, there wasn't enough good food, and sanitation became catastrophic. A stream ran through the camp, providing water, but thousands of prisoners also used the surrounding area for washing and human waste. The water became dangerously contaminated. Disease spread, diarrhea, dysentery, scurvy. Prisoners became severely malnourished. Some built tiny shelters from scraps of cloth, wood, or whatever they could find. Others had almost nothing. Summer brought brutal heat. Rain turned the ground into mud, and death became part of everyday life. Andersonville existed for only 14 months. Around 45,000 Union prisoners passed through it. Nearly 13,000 died. Not over centuries, not over decades, just 14 months. For those trapped inside, the battlefield might have seemed almost merciful. So, prisons have existed for thousands of years, but throughout much of their history, being in prison could mean far more than losing your freedom. You'd be buried beneath a city, abandoned on an island, packed into a disease-filled cell, separated from almost every human being, transported across an ocean, or thrown into an overcrowded field where disease killed thousands around you mercilessly. And perhaps that's what made these places so terrifying. The walls weren't always the worst part. Sometimes it was the darkness, sometimes the disease, sometimes the isolation, and sometimes it was simply knowing that the world continued normally on the other side, while your entire world had been reduced to a few meters of stone, mud, and bars. Because throughout history, some prisons were merely designed to stop you from leaving. Surviving them was punishment enough.